I'm really thrilled to be able to join tonight. What an amazing gathering, and I'm glad that we have this time to think about an issue that certainly we've all experienced, if not personally, certainly within one degree of all of us, in our training, in our educations, as we work with trainees, as we all sort of climb various ladders in our life. It's interesting that this is a language that has emerged. It's a word that is labeling a phenomena, but I'm sure all of us have individual experiences that we'll have time to share at our tables. But I'm so glad that we have Dr. Davidai and Dr. Carreon here to provide, just different perspectives on this. So I believe that we're going to start with Dr. Carreon.
So, in medical training can be rather grueling and very difficult at times. So when I was a third-year medical student, there was a for a lot of us, a very difficult part of medical training is internal medicine, where all of your book knowledge is put to the test. And so I was, I was also like the student in the story, got top of my class in high school, but once you go to Stanford Medical School, there's not many top people. So I did okay, but internal medicine was really hard. And so as I started to, frankly, fail to translate what I learned in my test scores to applying it to real patients, I started to get more and more anxious. My hands started to tremble. I had maybe not the most supportive supervisor at that time. My attending physician noticed that and pointed it out, and of course that did not help. And so the next time I had to give a presentation, it was even more shaky and even more. And so this sort of started to spiral, and for the first time in my professional life, it was really a question of not just am I going to be able to get the A or the A+, but am I even going to pass? Like, I made it this far. I've got now hundreds of dollars of medical school debt, and was I even going to be able to pass? And that was a very shocking moment. But more than that, I defined myself as I'm a doctor. I'm going to be a doctor. That's who I am. And what if I couldn't pass this rotation? Then I'm not a doctor anymore. And so it started to hit me that the reason my hand was shaking wasn't that, I was nervous about not getting a good evaluation, but that I'd wrapped my identity up in becoming a doctor, that I'd put my personal value so high in this profession, in this job, that it was really an existential threat if I didn't pass, if I didn't give a good presentation. And so I became very, terrified. And over the course of very accelerated several weeks, really had to come to terms with, how do I overcome this? And realizing, my value isn't in whether or not I have this, very, well thought of profession or not. My value is in, as a Christian, that I'm a child of God, that I'm loved regardless of whether or not I'm successful at this career, whether or not I really did slip through the cracks and get to this point in my career without having the resources to pass. And so I studied more, I got some more resources, and was able to struggle through that rotation. Now, I did much better in my psychiatry rotation, I'll assure you. But it was a moment of imposter syndrome. Had I really gotten this far by mistake? Had somebody made an error in admitting me to Stanford Medical School? And so this topic hits close to home. So formally, it's been studied and described in this way. I think there's been one decent, and I say decent with it wasn't the best paper, but there's not much formal research on imposter syndrome, and that's significant by itself. But high-achieving individuals who, despite their objective success, fail to internalize their accomplishments and have persistent self-doubt and fear of being exposed as a fraud or imposter. This is sort of the research working definition of imposter syndrome. There have been first described in 1978. There have been 62 studies. And again, I'd love to see an actual meta-analysis on this, but it does look like maybe approximately half of the studies have found a gender effect, women more than men. About half found that it's worse for younger people than older people. And it's definitely worse with suicidal ideation history or suicide attempts or major depression. So in terms of formal research, that's about the limit of knowledge, but it is a metaphor more broadly for, I think, a certain kind of distress that people experience. This is one of my favorite things to do, and there's actual scholars in this room that can do this analysis formally, but Google Ngrams is an approximation of the entirety of the written English language and what percentage of the English language is made up by the word imposter syndrome. And so there's been from 1985 to 1995, rather dramatic growth. But you get to 2000, and you gotta rescale. It continues to grow. 2005, we got to rescale again. 2010, oh my gosh, we're out of control. 2015, and 2019. So if you plot this on a logarithmic scale, we're by about 2100, the entirety of the English language will be the word imposter syndrome. So, you know, we've limited resources all around. The word imposter syndrome is running out. But nonetheless, all jokes aside, it's an increasingly, exponentially more commonly used phrase to express a particular kind of distress. But why now? Like, why is this growing exponentially? And I think that part of it is just like we're finding new words and the same amount of distress is shifting to different descriptions. But I do think there's some things that make me think that some things really are worse. And as a psychiatrist who sees patients, there's a lot of suffering and a lot of distress. And I really do think that it is worse now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. This is Robert Putnam, classic study on loneliness. We're actually lonelier than we were on both objective and subjective measures. So in 1985, the typical American had 3 confidants. That is, if you ask somebody in a survey, could you name somebody you could talk to about important matters? Like, that's the limit of confidant. They can name 3 people. That's the typical response. And by, I think it was 2003, it had dropped to 1. So absolute enormous drop in confidence. And that's like the typical American, one single person in the world they could talk to about important things. That's bad. So more phones and less church. These are 2 other trends. So roughly 2009, after decades, ever since they've been keeping track of this, of stable participation in this both social and spiritual activity, there's been a drop in religious service attendance. Of course, it's a U.S. study, so most of that effect is Christian. Yeah, more phones. So this is a cathedral that has rented space to Samsung for advertising purposes. But I mean, I think that, again, the symbolism of that is just so deep. But yeah, we're spending a lot more time on our phones, and the social media that is connected to that is ever present. So here are numbers of, these are 12th graders starting around 2009 again. You just start to see these increases, perhaps sooner for people who identify as liberal and conservative, but it's kind of across the board getting worse and worse and worse with no end in sight. In academia, it might actually be harder. So, you know, if you just say, hey, well, you know, my supervisor and his supervisor, why can't I do what he did? And well, the answer might be because the number of government dollars going to research has dropped by 4-fold on a per PhD or 5+ year of college. The census only has 5+ years. They didn't do PhDs back in 1960, I found out. But yeah, huge drop in actual funding per person who has these kinds of degrees. And also the total number of jobs per person with these degrees is also down by like 4-fold. So it's actually harder. And then like science might be getting more complicated. So the number of people that collaborate on papers has been growing exponentially over the past years. So like, those are all hard things by themselves. And so like the idea that the heuristic, maybe I should just compare myself to my supervisor or their supervisor, might not work or might make it hard. Quick things to do about it. I mean, all these are, you know, careers in themselves. But one is just to be mentally healthy and take physical action to improve mental health. That sometimes it's bad mental health that's driving the psychology, bad physical health that's driving the psychology of imposter syndrome. I mean, there's plenty of patients that, you know, good eating, good exercise, and good sleep, and that's all they needed. But also confession. For imposter syndrome, the implication is that there's a deception that's involved. That somebody has that I've deceived the Stanford admissions committee. But if you talk about that, it's hard to, you can no longer be an imposter if you're confessing what the problem is. And so sharing that this is something that a lot of people struggle with. It's not rare. It relieves a lot of the stress. This is a great AA slogan. You're only as sick as your secrets. And we can get into these maybe in more detail. But trying to think quote unquote rationally about things. One of my mentors, Jeff Schwartz, likes to say, think about it from the perspective of a benevolent third party, somebody who knows you, cares about you, wants the best for you, and is not you. How would that person think about things? And so, motivation. Ask yourself, what is imposter syndrome, or what is this feeling? What is it doing? How is it? What does it say about me that's really good or beautiful? Remember that it's axiomatically false. I got this from one of my colleagues, Owen Muir. If you are the person who's asking the question, am I an imposter? You are not an imposter. Imposters don't ask themselves, am I an imposter? They're just lying to people. They know they're lying to people. But it's that there are, but also trying to think about questions of applying the standards you'd apply to yourself. If you think, well, if I had a friend, would that work? No, like you're judging yourself unfairly, and that's why it's painful. And then also considering the truth, some objective truth or reality of your self-evaluation. And then finally, seek. And I think asking the question, is there something that is grounding, or that would allow you to have significance regardless of professional success? So this is a study that I was helped in the design phase. When you do when you ask people, you interrupt people randomly throughout the day with various questions of their momentary states. People who had daily spiritual experiences at a high level, when something bad happens, it doesn't make the day worse. It doesn't make their sense of meaning, purpose, significance any worse. It makes it better. So there are states of spirit, and this is also whether you're theist or not, feeling connected, feeling like you are loved and cared about. When you have those things at a high level, it almost doesn't matter what happens in the world. In fact, the worse things happen in the world, the better you feel about things, which is one of these incredible paradoxes, incredible findings. And so seeking a sense of that connectedness or that significance or that identity that's resilient to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So that's my sort of intro, yeah. Thank you.
All right, so I wasn't planning on standing, but the chairs are low, and I did not wear a jacket for nothing, so I had to, both my wife and my 7-year-old son complimented, so I had to show you. Okay, let me just start a few things before I start talking about part of my work. I'm an imposter in a lot of ways. Maybe the most relevant now is I have no spiritual bone in my body. I am not supposed to be here. And in fact, Vicky outed me. The reason I'm here, or I think that I'm here, is because we're neighbors. And I somehow fooled her that I'm a nice guy. Or actually, it was more indirect. I fooled my wife into marrying me, and my wife. But you can see how. But you can see how an overly active mind, which is probably what brought us here, can lead to the attributions that we make with feelings of imposter. But I want to tell you a story, and it might seem relevant. I'm sure. I promise you it's relevant. This is 2014. I'm getting my PhD at Cornell. And as graduate students do, it's midday, sometime during the weekday, and I'm at a coffee shop rather than in the office. And I'm talking with another graduate student. And we're trying to talk about research, but we're actually just talking about ourselves. Like if I don't know if there's any psychologists in the room, but we really ascribe by the research is me search. And it doesn't really apply to like nuclear physicists, I understand. But so we're talking about just research when we talk about life. And when I ask him, this guy, Sebastian Jerry, now he's working for Google, and ask him, do you feel like everyone else has a better life than we do? We're like, yeah. Now, of course, both Sebastian and I are kind of quirky, so we're not sure whether this is true or not. So we turn to the barista, because we've been, at some point in their I've paid for their wages. I've had a lot of coffee there. So and I asked him, do you feel like everyone's having more fun than you? And he's like, yeah, everyone has more fun than me. And we just start thinking about this. Why is it that everyone else is having more fun than you? So we ran a few surveys, some studies as psychologists do, which is like, okay, so basically we want to see, am I weird or is this real? So we designed some research studies asking people different questions, like does it feel like people go out more than you? Does it feel like you go to more you get invited to less parties than other people? Do you feel like other people have denser, more meaningful social connections? And this is by far one of the largest effect sizes, the biggest things that we find. Overall, about 70 to 80% of people say yes, they agree with these things. They think that other people are having more fun than them, have a richer social life than them. Now, of course, that's impossible, right? 80% of the people can't say that everyone else is having more fun because that's impossible. But to us as psychologists, we're not just interested in documenting something weird that's happening, but also understanding why. And throughout trial and error in different studies, different research, here's what we find. And if you leave it with one thing today, I hope this is it, right? Bias samples and bias sampling. Now I'm going to break that down. What does that mean? Bias samples, right? There's a distribution for everything, right? There's tails for everything. But we don't see all the distribution. We see a bias sample. When you are a doctor in training at Stanford Medical School, you don't see all the other doctors in training in all the hundreds of schools in the country or thousands of schools around the world. You don't see the people that tried to make it to med school but didn't make it. All you see is that tail end. And in that tail, yes, you might not be the stellar person. And when you open your phone, right, all you see is other people having fun. Right? It would be very weird if people, posted on social media, here's my dinner, some mashed potatoes, and a kid with food all over their face. That's not what we post, right? So the sample is biased. And I agree with what David was saying, that with modern technology, we have more accessibility to these biased samples. And we know, in the back of our minds, we know that people are curating their lives. They're not showing us everything, but that's not what we experience. So that's the bias sample. But nothing new about the bias sample, because the bias sample occurred 50, 100 years ago as well. When you would always tell people about the good things that happen in your life and not so much about the bad things. So the bias sample is there. But what's something that's more interesting, and this is where it gets more into the mind, the psychology of it, is the biased sampling. In addition to the fact that we're only exposed to that very, very narrow tail, we also don't focus on everyone in that tail. We sample in a biased way. Now, what do I mean by that? Think back to your days when you had time and a social life, and maybe you were at college and you were, you're sitting in your dorm room, and you're trying to study, and next door there was a party going on. You were acutely aware of that party, right? Because it's noisy, You get sensory experience of it. You always keep thinking about what's happening. People start knocking on your door. Is the party here? No, it's not here. They close the door, right? But every once in a while, you got invited to a party. And when you were at that party, how often did you think of the people that weren't at the party? How often did you think of the people in the other dorm rooms that might be studying? Now, not only were you getting a biased sample of the people that were only at the party, you're also only sampling on those people. You're not sampling on everyone else, but if you thought about it, they were there. Now, so what we did in our studies is we started off by just asking people, what does it mean to have a rich social life? People give us an answer. We actually didn't care about what answer they gave us, because what we asked them is, who comes to mind when you think of having a rich social life? Now, people can think about all sorts of things. They can think of someone who's an exemplar of that's a rich social life, or they can think of someone who's an exemplar of like that's not, right? That's you can learn what a rich social life by don't do what that person does. But those are not the people that come to our mind. When we think about who goes to parties, like am I going to enough parties? What we think about is other people that go to a lot of parties. So we started doing this research. Sebastian and I, we published a paper. I think if I might say so myself, it's a good paper. It's called Home Alone. That's how we titled the paper. The accessibility of mentally available lovers. But then we started thinking, how broad is this? And we started realizing in every type of social comparisons that we make in our lives, the people that come to mind are not representative of the sample. They are the extreme. Do you publish enough? I don't know. So many of you seem tenured, so maybe that doesn't trouble you. I'm not tenured. That troubles me. So the question is, do I publish enough? So now the question is, what is enough? Oops. And then who comes to mind? And the people that come to mind are not the majority of researchers that have very few papers, very few citations. By definition, those are the majority. The people that come to mind are those stars. The stars in my field, the stars in my division, my department, the stars at the business school who, for some reason, have hundreds of publications that are, the age index is off the chart. Those are the people that come to mind. And those are the people that I evaluate myself based on. And this is what we found. For every trait that we found, physical attractiveness. Think about it. How do you measure physical attractiveness? It's only relative. There's no absolute measure. The only way for us to do that is comparing to other people. But who do we compare ourselves to? Now, I'm not the best looking person in the world, but there are some ugly people out there. Now, I'm not going to say who. That's up to you. There are some ugly people out there. But, and this is the important thing, when I think of myself, am I physically attractive? Those people don't come to mind. The people that come to mind are the really attractive people. And we found that again and again in all different kinds of traits that people evaluate yourself. When you don't have an objective way to measure yourself, you base your evaluation on social comparison. And that's when a biased sample and biased sampling comes to play. I'll leave you with one thing before I sit down, because I didn't have enough time to write you a shorter letter, right? I could just speak on forever. But I'll leave you with one thing, what we did. In one study, we asked people, before we had them, we asked them about their physical fitness. How physically fit are you? Right? Think about it. How, are you physically fit? Again, that's not there's no objective way. You have to do some sort of comparison. So we asked people, how physically fit are you? But we split them into two groups randomly. One group, we asked them to name the first person that comes to mind before they answer the question. Write the initials of the first person that comes to mind, then they say, how physically fit are they? The other people, we asked them the first person to come to mind, then the second person, and the third person. We had up to 7 people. We asked them, name 7 people that just came to mind. What we found was when you engage in more social comparison, when you think of more and more people, you start sampling not on the ones that are most mentally accessible, but also on the people that you have to think a lot more to get to. And then you start seeing that those that thought of one person thought they weren't physically active because they thought about someone who cycles a lot, who goes to the gym every day, someone physically active. But those that thought about a lot of people, those people felt much more physically fit because they brought more people to mind. So I'll finish with this. Teddy Roosevelt, famous for saying, comparison is the thief of joy. Or at least credited to him. What I think is not enough comparison is the thief of joy. The problem is not that we compare ourselves, because by definition, on the most important things in life, we have to compare ourselves. Are you rich? Well, what does that mean? On the important things that you have to compare yourself. The problem is that we stop with the first exemplars that come to mind and we compare ourselves to them, not realizing that those are biased exemplars. So the problem is that we don't think of enough people. So next time you have to evaluate yourself and you maybe feel a bit down, start thinking of yourself, who else can I think about that comes to mind? Who else? Not in a way of cheating yourself, but in trying to get a more accurate view of the sample. I think I went way overboard. I'll sit down now. Those in the back, you're not going to see me, but I promise I'm here. All right.
Thank you so much, David and Shai, for framing this issue that I think we've all experienced in some capacity. You've outlined a bit of the sort of social determinants, the phenomenological experiences as a culture in our language, and now I'm starting to reflect on, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, as I think of people as developing over time, what kinds of thoughts do you have on what this looks like, not just in different stages of human growth, but also in stages of like academic growth, family growth, social status, when, the data out there is limited, but what are your thoughts on those factors, the developmental factors, the trajectories, right? We all are sampling our N of 1, right? But what are your reflections on like that other dimension of time, and also what your social circle is determined by, right, as you grow?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that I think it's the three studies. I think the three studies that found an age effect are probably right. I do think that there's a developmental aspect of asking who am I, and am I keeping up? And there are certain stages where, if you've had that question again and again and again, answered like, yeah, no, okay, maybe you cheated your way through high school and got into, snuck into college, but once you get into grad school and get your PhD and get a faculty position and get tenure, you probably would have been found out by that point. So maybe. So maybe there's an aspect of the imposter thing becomes objectively more implausible, but it also raises the question of it's still there for a lot of people, and so that needs to be considered. That it's always a shall we say temptation to think that I'm not enough, or for there to be that mismatch between how I feel subjectively and my social standing. And there's a lot of things that can influence both of those things. Where should I be by comparison to social standing at this age or stage or whatever it is, and then also how do I feel inside, and various things that would influence that. Be it anything from I'm eating terribly. There's only so much ramen that one can have and still feel good about oneself. But all that to say, it's. So all that that I think the stage effects are probably real, but also underscore how this might be a area where people can think about themselves unfairly at any age.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I used to have just one imposter syndrome. I used to think that I somehow made it into academia, although I shouldn't have, partly because I came from Israel. I had a very thick accent moving here. I had no idea, everyone in my cohort was Ivy League educated. So I felt like, I don't belong here. But then I had a kid. And then I realized, I'm also an imposter dad. Because while I'm trying to get those publications out, the better dads are in the playground with their kids. So I think the psychology remains the same, the content changes, right? At the same time, we do know that there's more emotional stability that comes with age. Famously, it's been said that you at first kids think that everyone loves them, then teenagers think that everyone hates them, and then adults realize nobody's even thinking about them. So, and part of being an imposter is like thinking that other people will find out, and it helps when you don't think about other people. So I think there is a bit of more emotional stability, but this, the turnout here, makes me believe that not everyone here is just for the free food. People realize that it's something that affects you different ways in all ages.
Yes, I really resonate with that comment. I think I'm an imposter in multiple areas, in multiple intersecting planes of my life. The term imposter phenomena was first identified in high-performing women, right? And I'm sitting here as a woman, as a person of color, and realizing that, as the data, we realize that all populations experience imposter syndrome, but there's an increased vulnerability, increased rate among folks that may feel marginalized or underrepresented, so people of color, women in certain fields, immigration status. When you are younger, you feel more vulnerable compared to the majority of the population who have actually reached maturity, right? Children are still the minority of any population, right? And they are physically, of course, smaller, and so feel less than. So there are some things that I think are to be developmentally expected for children, but then, as a society, how do we think about the multiple ways that imposter syndrome can intersect, right? And what do we do to combat that, right? To recognize it. And one thing that came up in both of your talks was the key role of not isolating, right? Not decreasing your sample and kind of digging into that data, but expanding, right? Getting into community, speaking openly and truthfully, confessing. Start sampling 6 more people, right? To increase your N from 1 to 7, right? If you're going to compare, right, to start to listen to diverse voices. And so maybe what do you think in terms of what are other ways that we maybe as a community, right, whether here at our various institutions in New York or maybe within our departments, can counteract the tendency to isolate. So I, as a Asian woman, right, might limit myself and say, I can only be understood by other Asian women, right, in my field, in my subsection of psychiatry at my institution, and then really delude myself, right, into feeling I am all alone and I am the lone imposter in this room, when in reality, recognizing that the struggle is much more universal and actually probably an indicator, right, of my emotional and social ability to pick up, to read a room, to notice my status in society. It actually may be a plus that is turned into a negative, right, that is working against me now and cutting me off from the very resource that would help orient me. So any thoughts on the multiple imposter profiles that we carry within ourselves?
Yeah. So here's something that helps me a little bit on a good day. I wrote a quote down. I wonder if anyone, maybe historians here, anyone recognizes this quote. I am very poorly today and very stupid. That's very esoteric. Does anyone have any guess who said that? It's a quote from Charles Darwin in 1861, writing to his friend. And the idea that Charles Darwin can confess to a friend that he feels stupid, where, no offense to anyone here, but he's Charles Darwin and we're not. is, to me, it's just mind-blowing, right? So on the one hand, you could take it as like in a pessimistic way, which sometimes I do, is like, oh, everybody feels this way, there's no hope for me. But then, wait for it. But then you can take it in the optimistic way, which is everybody feels this way. So there's hope for me. Right? And, you know, I'm a real true believer in the truth shall set you free, in the sense that just knowing that these things are common. And for me, that means doing research in psychology and understanding, you know, the prevalence of these kind of beliefs. But it could also be just reading about other people's experiences, asking people about their experiences. Just knowing that it's out there makes me feel less alone in the struggle. Am I less isolated? Well, I spent 12 hours today in my office by myself before coming here, so probably not. I mean, I did talk with the cafeteria person when I bought food for lunch, but that's it. But mentally, knowing that this is not something you're going through by yourself has been really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I will emphasize is also, so one of the modes of psychotherapy is cognitive behavioral therapy, and there you're looking, at least in part, at the truth or falsehood of certain cognitions or beliefs that people have, particularly about themselves. And there's all sorts of really interesting research on of how similar stimuli or identical stimuli can have different neural responses based on what you do with it. So we were talking about this before the coming up here. One of my favorite studies is titled "Putting Feelings into Words," and so if you show people an emotional face, their amygdala is going to light up. But if you have them say, don't just respond to it, just think of the word that matches to that face, or match the word and the face, there's a different brain response. The stimulus is identical, the same same photons hitting the same retina, going to the same visual cortex, but it routes differently in the brain based on what you're doing. And so when you're in a social setting, and for example, writing a letter to your friend about how stupid you are as Charles Darwin, and you're the friend responding in the letter, you're not responding with your own amygdala. You're thinking rationally. You're Charles Darwin, and maybe you'll do something good someday, you know, and you'll respond with, I imagine, something like that. And so it's and that's partly what community can do on the lay side. And of course, if things get more serious, formal psychotherapy can be very helpful at helping unravel some of these, distorted brain messages, or false thoughts, or cognitive distortions. But I do agree. And he said he wasn't no spiritual bone in his body, but he just quotes Jesus up here before I do. I also agree that the truth shall make you free. But
misquote. And I think I would add something else. And just by a show of hands, is anyone here, an occasional runner, cyclist? Okay, so we have a few that are okay. So, you know that feeling when you go out for a run or a cycle, and you're just facing a headwind, and that run is just, it's excruciating pain. Like you're like, oh, why did I do this? I should have stayed home. And like every step is difficult. And then you turn around and, and on your way back home, now naturally the wind is now at your back. So you're enjoying the tailwind for a few seconds. And then what happens? You kind of forget about it and your mind goes to like other stuff. And to me, that's fascinating. And in fact, my grad school advisor and I, we conducted a series of studies about exactly this phenomenon, what we call the headwind-tailwind asymmetry, which is hard things in our lives are in our face. By definition, we have to deal with them in order to get them out of our face. We can't not pay attention to them. the good things, the easy things, the wind at our back, we don't need to attend to it. We can just enjoy it and move on, which is very adaptive. But the problem is that we spend more time focusing on the difficulties that we face and not enough time on the things that give us, that leg up, that push us forward. With one caveat, and I'm happy to talk about that one caveat later, but what we found that this shows up in all different kinds of situations in life. We talked about siblings rivalry before. We found that we ask people, we surveyed people that have one and only one sibling, and we asked them, who does your parent love more? Now, statistically, we should get half the people saying the other one and half the people saying me. And that's not what we got. We randomly selected Republicans and Democrats and said, who does the Electoral College benefit? Both parties thought it's the other side. We surveyed 1,000 researchers in accounting. Is anyone here in accounting? Okay, so researchers in accounting, there's experimental accounting, and then there's archival accounting. And we ask who has an easier time getting into journals? It's the other ones. We're the ones that face all the difficulties. And that's a problem because now, of course, it's a problem, but once you realize it, I promise you, next time you're on a run or cycling, and you'll have that hard time, you'll be like, oh, I can't believe I'm running today. And you're like, oh, wait, the same wind is going to help me on my way back, right? And it just knowing about the way our mind works, for me at least, has been really helpful.
And I think it's a great insight, and I think this goes for all of these, particularly sort of cognitive biases. They mostly can be overcome, or that they can often be overcome with directed attention. That if you're for the feelings into words, it's the conscious application of attention. You can direct the brain in various ways with this knowledge, and so but this also gets to habit, and so that there are sort of defaults that might be because we're primates, and that we share with chimpanzees. I don't know if you've done any of this work on chimpanzees, but they also love to compare with each other. You pay a chimpanzee unfairly, and they are not happy. They're very well aware to know that equal work equals equal pay, and they're going to throw your banana back in your face if you pay them, not what they are owed. And so you've got these really interesting experiments of like, okay, some of this is just like, primate brain, and, some of it might be even like, deeper or older, however you want to call it. But that we also have this sort of, at least bigger, if not overlaid, depending on what level we're comparing to, prefrontal cortex that allows us to override that. And if you repeatedly do that, you can build a habit. You could do that automatically. And this is, my own... I'm persuaded by virtue ethics on the philosophy question. The idea that you've achieved virtue when you're not even tempted by the thing that's going wrong. You've done the thing so often and so well, so long, that when the temptation comes, you're not even tempted. One philosopher I like put it, if Blackbeard's a Kantian and he's really trying hard to not steal, and a bank vault spills open, he'll think, I ought not steal what is not mine, and he'll resist the temptation. So he's good on on deontological ethics. Francis of Assisi, same thing. Bank vault opens up. Who would want money? Not even tempted by somebody else's money. You're just going to go about your life and talking to the birds and preaching the good news. But that when you've really achieved virtue, it's not something you're having to apply conscious attention to anymore. And what are the limits of that? Who even knows? But I think that to some of these biases, some of them are baked real deep, and particularly if you've got a mental illness or depression, like it is real deep. But it still means that therapy proves that these things are malleable to some extent, and even biologically.
Yes, I agree. I think we're all recognizing that we're walking around with these cognitive biases, and we're biased about our biases as well. Like there's like multiple layers of self-deception that we can walk around in and still be highly functioning adults. In my work with children and families, I see that we are all asking the question like, what is enough? What is the truth? What is the standard by which I can judge if I'm doing all right or am I a failure? And really, it starts when we're young, right? As children, our parental, our caregiver affirmations or criticisms tend to kind of draw the lines, right? This kind of calibrates the way that we think of ourselves and the way that we evaluate others. And sibling rivalry is an example where your calibration can be off, right? And clearly we tend to veer off these things. The original study that described imposter phenomena described that the family dynamics of these high-performing women tended to be of two types, where either one, the woman was the sibling of a superstar, a golden child, and they were considered the inferior sibling, or they were the superstar, right? And in both cases, there is this false attribution, over-attribution of credit to one person and under-attribution to the other person, which carried on for the rest of their life, either trying to prove or disprove the position that they were in. And, Shai, you're saying that if you interviewed siblings, right, the majority will say, I was not the loved one, I was not the beloved one. But what do we do with this in our families, in our departments? And my answer as a clinician has always been to counsel parents to say there is a third option where you don't choose a favorite, you actually celebrate each one of your children for their unique attributes, right? That they are separate individuals. They're not just clones off of yourself or competitors against one another, but what a marvelous, diverse team we have with resilience, different resources brought in by different kids, even within the family as an extended family system. But we are looking to somebody to speak truth like that over us. And some of us do not have that in our departments or in our families of origin even, right? So what are some of the internal resources if you are swimming in a difficult environment where your social group is not one that's going to affirm or celebrate diversity or celebrate your unique gifting or talent or personality traits? What are some internal resources or the intangible resources that we can draw from so that we can correct some of these cognitive biases? How can we test? How do I know that, what are the stars out there that I need to compare myself to? And does it make sense? Should I shoot for the moon, fall among the stars? How do we recalibrate ourselves if our environment that is immediately around us cannot be the trusted community to do so?
So I have thoughts about the internal. I actually think by putting the burden on individuals to deal with their imposter syndrome, we are blinding ourselves to the real reason, right? And the real well, we all are interested in the real ultimate reason. One reason that I believe that it's so prevalent is the external environment. So I'm sorry if I'm doing the obvious kind of like, oh, let me answer a different question. But but I do think it's important to note. We evolved in small groups where we each had our specialty, right? You were the musician, right? You knocked on some rocks together. You were the one that knew how to draw on the cave wall. You were the best hunter. You were the best gatherer, right? Everyone had something that they were somewhat unique to the group. And we were also very vigilant about the ones that didn't have anything, right? The free riders, the ones that didn't really contribute anything. But throughout history, we've kind of taken all these different status ladders and we've collapsed them onto one, right? So, let's take the U.S. as an example. It's some sort of socioeconomic ladder, which the best musicians, they are, or not the best, but the most lauded musicians are, rewarded in the same way that the most lauded actors, with the most lauded innovators. And then we basically evaluate everyone based on this one output, which is how much money do you have, or what is your celebrity, how many likes do you have. In academia, we do it based on publications, right? So, of course, when you collapse, when you reduce all value into one metric, you're going to have a lot of people feeling that they're falling through the cracks, that they're falling behind. So to really deal with the issue, we need to rethink the system, right? Like, what are other ways of evaluating each other so we evaluate ourselves differently? Is that helpful for you today when you go home? Probably not. But I think it's a deeper conversation that we need to have. What are other ways that we can value each other so that maybe not everyone, but many of us can feel like they're contributing and feel confident in their contribution?
No, I think that's well put. And I do think that the sort of collapse into this single metric does create a very particular kind of hierarchy where there are a lot more losers than winners. But one solution is to have multiple hierarchies that are that are intertwined. But I think also ultimately the trying to have that telos, or the thing that you're going after, be something that's eternal, or that could stand for, that could create unity, even if everybody's going after it. So again, in the Christian worldview, that single virtue, or that word that encapsulates the one thing that is the good is love, or agape. Sorry. So agape is this thing that is this word that represents compassionate concern, or desire for the good of the other, and that's something that we can compete forever about, and that if we're trying to outdo each other in being truly compassionate, and not just like pushover compassionate, but like really trying to work for the good of other people, it's something that is a hierarchy that points to the ultimate good, which would be God, and that's and that also gets another sort of getting to the comparison thing. I do think that absent that, all you have is comparison with other people. If there is no objective end that is above it all, there is no way to know where you are except relative to other people, and that's always inevitably going to be competitive and potentially in a bad way. But I think that the other thing is that there is another study on comparison, and that I think this is if I recall, it's been years since I looked at the details of it, but it was looking at self-appraisal versus other appraisal, and what part of the brain is used for that. And there's different parts of the medial prefrontal cortex that are used. And in secular folks, it was two different regions. There's one region of the brain to assess for self, and a different region of the brain to assess for other. But for the Christians in the sample, it was the same region. It was the other region. It was the part of the brain. It was, in essence, they were asking not, am I a compassionate person? Am I a courageous person? It's, does Jesus or does God think that I'm a courageous or adventurous person? Sorry about that. So all that to say, I do think that there's an escape from this sort of all against all kind of universe, but you have to go up.
Thank you. I mean, I think we recognize that if the metrics collapse into a singular hierarchy, that some people are going to fall off the ladder, right? And we need to expand beyond at least challenge, right, internally, but also within your whatever circle you're in, to recognize that we have to expand the hierarchies. We have to expand the system to question why we value each other, what makes a person worthy of dignity, worthy of respect, and perhaps challenge metrics of performance, of competition, of zero-sum game, of basically dog eat dog, and then find something that, as a psychotherapist, we recognize, like, I have to be in a position of complete benevolence, right, towards the person that I'm treating. I'm standing in for parents who should, in an ideal world, love their child regardless of what they can produce, regardless of their contribution to the family. An infant doesn't contribute; they're a net liability at that point, right? But that love that you have towards a child, we are seeking that for the entirety of our adult lives, and in a way to transcend, right, what peers, what society tells us, what social media tells us is valuable, to find that anchor that will endure, whether or not the metrics change on you. The worst thing is when you climb the ladder and you realize the ladder is switched on you, right? You finally make enough publications and then, nope, it was the social connectedness, right? It was the networking and the politics, and you're like, how devastating, right? So to ground yourself, to anchor yourself in some way beyond a single metric. So thank you so much for a really intriguing beginning of a discussion. At this time, we're going to turn to our tables, and table leaders will continue the discussion in our smaller groups. Please limit, just reminders to table leaders, please limit introductions as you introduce yourselves. Please limit your introductions to 60 seconds or less. So this is a speed dating round, but to allow time to actually talk about this important phenomena. Thank you so much. And we're going to come back, right?
Yeah.
We had a great discussion talking about where this self-doubt comes from. And sometimes it can be justified and sometimes not. And sometimes we can perceive that it might come from something about us that we can't change, which would be very unfortunate as well. But do you three have any idea as to how we might individually determine the difference between good self-doubt, which is like a hallmark of modern science, right? And we don't want to abandon that, because the abandonment of self-doubt will lead to the abandonment of science. And bad self-doubt, which is what we are talking about in the imposter syndrome. So what's the difference between good and bad self-doubt?
The truth. But in all seriousness, this is so. I think this could be on a virtue ethics frame. It's courage is the right balance of not being too brash and not being too too cowardly. You want to be the right amount of brave. You don't want to just in battle run into machine gun fire on the one hand, but you also don't want to just hide in your bunker. You've got to have the right amount to have the virtue we call courage. And so I think that from a self-judgment standpoint, I think it is fair and appropriate to be able to look, well, how far along in life should I be compared to other people at this stage? It's a fair question to ask. Now, but how valuable a human being am I because of that is maybe a separate question that is should be at least weighted on the low end, in my opinion. But all that to say is it's a matter of does your judgment line up with the truth? And as I am a firm believer that there is such a thing that we can get to. And again, with the scientific enterprise also, it's this thing that we are all trying to seek, truth, as a collective enterprise. That we can doubt one another's work because, hey, I did the experiment and didn't replicate. That's bad news or maybe good news, I guess, depending on the the study. But I think that the ability to appropriately question things that are false, but also not over-question or not be overly skeptical when the setting is wrong.
I'll say that we know that among the treatments that are recommended for someone who might be experiencing imposter phenomena, a lot of them include essentially removing yourself from that individual bias, and so group therapy, peer support, mentoring, right? Getting input from people around you who can provide you with a sense of at least correction in self-evaluation. And so does your self-doubt actually line up with their independent, multiply reinforced observations of you, right? So rather than only listening to just one person's feedback or a single reviewer's comments or whatever it is, right? Rather than dwelling over and over again and then finding yourself skewed, right? To look for multiple perspectives and to kind of get a 3D stereoptic perception of you. And I guess we rely on that because do we believe that multiple observers collectively will describe a universal truth, right? Because we say that actually if multiple people observe the same thing, it must be true, versus one person's report, two people can be tricked, folie à deux, but you get but you get multiple people witnessing the same event. There must be something, right, substantial and objectively true. So some of this is, we know that the amygdala, the part of the brain that registers and produces fear, right, its activity, as David was saying, is ameliorated by the use of words, but the production of language is really a call for other people. You're communicating your experience to other people so that they can respond. And so there is something here in to stay in community, to whatever as you're seeking truth, to not do it alone, right? We know that the definition of a mad scientist is what? Someone who maybe does have rigorous scientific skill, but is completely eccentric, right? Has isolated themselves and enclosed themselves in a place where they are not open to feedback or challenge or testing and reinforcement. So,
I would say this. So I started off by saying I'm not spiritual at all, but as biology and history has made it that I was born and raised Jewish. I'm very Jewish, even more now that I live in New York, and something that that I and many live by is that your thoughts don't matter. It's your behaviors that matter. You can think whatever you want, but if it comes off as maladaptive in your behavior, then it becomes a problem. And I'll give an example from my own life. In November, I experienced 2 rejections of papers that I cared deeply about, painful rejections. And then I found a way of not getting any more rejections, which is not submitting any more papers. So this is serious. So for 3 months, from mid-November to mid-February, so just a few weeks ago, was my longest streak of not getting rejected. And I was feeling good about myself. And then I realized, I'm not getting rejected because I'm not putting myself out there. And then I realized that that's when the self-doubt becomes maladaptive, right? So then, so what I did was just all right, so now you got to put yourself out there. And it's partly practicing non-attachment, partly practicing what was mentioned before of focusing on my other things that I'm good at. So spending more time, other than today, I'm every day with my kids for bedtime. So I have value in other things. And now when I feel value in other things, I can push myself out there in the thing where I'm worried about. So if and when I get hit down again, it's not my whole self kind of linked into that.
I just want to say, Table 3, the discussion of the imposter syndrome led to a discussion of external comparisons, and we all agreed that external comparisons are inexorable, particularly in academia, where how many papers we publish and that kind of thing gets compared with what everybody else does. And then one person discussed the relationship to God without comparing yourself to others and how important that could be. And another member of the table, who was a non-believer, said, well, we should substitute love for God, and that we could work independently of those kinds of social comparisons. And another person in the table suggested that there's some kind of golden mean between being independent and being devoted to God or to love, and also social comparisons become important, but not as important if you have this sort of golden mean between what's external and what's internal in yourself. And I don't know if there's a question in there, but that's what we discussed. Okay.
I'll just add to that while we're waiting for someone else. I think what comes out of that is just don't have your comparisons based on what comes to mind readily, right? Be intentional about it. So this is something that I learned and try to put into play from my graduate school advisor, who I asked him, like, how do you know that you're a good researcher? And he said, I have a few people that I respect, and if they respect my work, then my work here is done. And I asked him who the people. He named 3 people, and I thought that was very smart. It's being intentional about whose accolades you're looking for, and that could be, for some people, if you're a believer, God. It could be, your significant other. It could be your graduate school advisor. It could be whatever. Because in a way, we're all just like calling out, "Mommy, Daddy, please love me," right? Like, it's just in different ways. We're looking for that, replacement.
Hi, thank you so much for this thought-provoking evening. I guess I want to shift things a little bit to the question of what we value, and also what we as a community, as an earth, need, and where we need to move with that. And I think that we have to get beyond, we're primates, we're competitive, we're in the academic, and really think, what is the bottom line? And it has nothing to do with individualism. It has more to do with collectivity. And it's really to look to the future, and it's not like 1,000 years from now. I mean, it's really, they say we have 9 more years left. So that's where I would like this discussion, well, that's maybe almost ending, to go, because yes, we all have to deal with students and ourselves and individuals, but I think that we really have to push that a little bit further.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think that it's you're right. I think that in the sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with humans. And that, how do we solve that problem? We're a warring, cheating, greedy, destructive species, and have been for some time now. And yeah, like what are the solutions there? And so I do think that we've got these sort of immediate scope problems of, so too at any academic department. It's the same, it's a similar story. But how do we address these things? And I do think that this is getting to incremental progress seems like it's not going to work, and I do think that's these drastic things of the transformation. That spiritual transformation is the way, is the only way, and that's true for me as a person, as an individual. We were talking at our table about, yes, I'm a Christian and I believe in heaven, but I'm not completely transformed by that. If I really believed in it, if it was fully present, the way I'd live my life would be even more different. And so even for myself, who I believe has been transformed in some important ways, it's insufficient. And I think that we all feel that in some sense. But this gets to how do we get beyond that? And I do think that the answers have to be more than we should try as hard as we can, but also recognize that all that trying isn't going to get us to the destination that we seek, whether it be 8 years or 80 years or until the sun goes out. We've only got a certain amount of time left.
That's a hard question. So I really like the idea that Michael Sandel, a professor of ethics at Harvard, says that imagine that instead of presidential debates, we had value debates. Just like, highly televised, just like people standing on stage and argue, what do we stand for? Now, the idea is not to get to an answer. So this is where I diverge from David. I don't think there's a one thing, a power or something, but getting to some sort of consensus of here's what we as a society or as a group, whatever big or small, stand for. Because when you build a system that doesn't have shared values, or that doesn't update the values, then you see, I'm experiencing it very well right now in Israel, in my home country, right? It's a country that had a shared value for most people. The society has changed. There was no discussion over what is our shared value anymore. And one day you wake up and there's 3 or 4 different factions that don't share any values. And yet somehow we're supposed to live under the same system with the same rules. So I think it is important that we have these discussions. And these discussions, a lot of us have them, with our significant others. What do we say? Like before you have a child, you say, like, what kind of parents do we want to be? What kind of kid do we want to raise? That is what you stand for, what you value as a family. Some of us have it in a bigger, kind of like with our friends and neighbors. That's rare. It's very rare that we have it with our academic, department. And it's extremely rare that we have it with strangers in our community. But we have the scaffolding for that. We know how to do it with people we love and care about. So I don't know the answer of what do we value or what we share, but we don't talk about it. So maybe that's the way, just having these conversations. And one thing I would say, it's not with a round table of like 3 people talking. It's everyone going around, if we had the time, what do you value? But yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the idea that we have to lift our eyes off of our own navels, right? Get off of the individualism, the self-absorption, the competition, for scarce resources for myself or whatever I can grab in my lifetime. That we have to lift our eyes up, around, and up, and say, what do we all see, right, collectively? What will our children see, right? Rather than fall into the cognitive bias of catastrophizing and saying, this is it, the end is near, and I may as well fall into hopelessness and passivity and nihilism, right? What do we do with the time that we do have? We don't know how long we have, right? Is it forecast 9 years? Do I have 90 years with medical technology, or do I have 9 days, right? I don't know. So with the time that we have, to agree with one another, to say, let's search beyond ourselves, to transcend, right? Whether you're a person of faith or whether you're secular, we know that orientation, that stance, right, as we face the uncertainty of life and our careers, et cetera, right, that stance is something that stabilizes us, that allows us to dialogue, that we all are seeking peace, love, growth, not stagnation, death, and destruction, even though we have that tendency in us all, right? Even pure science has been usurped, right, to be used for destructive purposes, but only we, in acknowledging sort of the dignity, the beauty, the humanity, the uniqueness of like this community and the communities that we're just privileged to be part of, right? Not even by choice, but that we're born into, this time and place. We recognize just how amazing that is. Then we can begin to talk among those universals, that universal search, and something that's transcendent, like, am I beloved by a good God? Or can I experience something transcendent in the love that is shared by people, in the love that we all have for our children, for our students, for our trainees, for the next generation, to lift our eyes up rather than down to our navels and then down to the grave, really. That's unfortunately where many people fall into depression, and that skewed perspective pulls us apart from one another when we could be holding each other, shoulder by shoulder, shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm. So I'm so grateful that we're having this discussion. Hopefully this will ignite many more smaller discussions in whatever circles of influence you have, right? Take this little seed, this gift, and just allow it to grow, right? It's spring, right? So.